Everyone. I am really honored to be here. What I'm going to be sharing with you is a paper that I prepared for the World Archaeological Congress, which was held earlier in July, on July 7th. And Sarah Iris Rigsby very kindly asked me if I would record it to present to you at Tidally United. I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm not. I'm currently doing some fieldwork out in Wyoming, which I am thrilled to go to do, but I'm also deeply honored with the chance to share some thoughts and ideas with you. With that, let me start my presentation. In hopes that you can all see my screen. Here we go. So I am Marcy Rockman, and I am speaking from Washington, D.C. And I would like to acknowledge that the city of Washington, D.C. is finally now recognized as existing, being built on the ancestral homelands of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples. Now, as I said, this paper was prepared for WAC. And on June 24th, as I was starting to put together my notes for WAC to present, the US Supreme Court released its decision overturning Roe versus Wade. Now, as I expect you all know, Roe versus Wade is a Supreme Court decision made in 1972, 50 years ago, that set access to abortion as a constitutional right. In overturning Roe versus Wade, the majority of the Supreme Court claimed that it had no choice in doing this, that the word abortion is not specifically mentioned in the US Constitution, which was written in the 1780s, and that there's a history that can be identified from the 19th century onward that considered abortion to be a crime. Against these older histories, the court said, the decision made in 1972 to change course and to create a new context for society in relation to abortion and the 50 years of social practice of that right must be seen as wrong. And so they have acted on that wish and have set in motion a reversion in the US to those earlier times. On June 30th, just a few days after that, and still not long ago, the US Supreme Court issued another decision, West Virginia versus EPA, that directly reduces and challenges the capacity of the US government to address climate change. This decision is directly devastating to US efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It may eventually be possible to work around them with states and localities and other approaches. But with the time we have in the carbon budgets that exist, time to find new solutions is something that we do not have to spare. Now, I set this whole presentation together for WAC, for people who were listening primarily in Prague. And I know many of you are in Florida at Tidally United, which is often still can seem, I'm sure, a world away from Washington, D.C. But at the same time, perhaps in part because of that distance, many of you may know far better than I do the ripple effects of the things that both the US does and doesn't do and the things that Washington, D.C. does and does not do. Both US Supreme Court decisions will have wide effects for the work we do and the lives that we live. The climate change decision is going to be more measurable in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and the climate impacts that develop from those. But the new Roe versus Wade decision involves how we define and see and use our relationships to the past. So how we respond to this and take our next steps will, I think, be very important. So I'm going to use this, our relationships to the past, as a frame to share with you experiences from two recent major international climate heritage events. The first of these was a project to more directly and fully link cultural heritage with the work and reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. This took the form of an international co-sponsored meeting, which is the first formal step into the sphere of the IPCC and potentially move towards an IPCC special report. Development of the international co-sponsored meeting on culture, heritage, and climate change was initiated by ICOMOS, which is the International Council on Monuments and Sites, which was then joined by UNESCO and the IPCC. For 2 years, from mid-2019 through mid-2021, I served as co-chair on behalf of ICOMOS of the project to develop this meeting. Now, there are many lines of evidence that we pulled from to explain why this meeting was needed. One of these is drawn from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report released in 2014. And this is a full-page box that describes how earlier societies experienced past environmental change and the potential to learn from them. And I just want to point you to the very end sentence of this box that says it would be useful to consider how lessons learned from historical experience may relate to perceived multiple environmental changes characterized by the Anthropocene. Now, the proposal that we sent to the IPCC, and which once they accepted it became the outline for the meeting, included 5 overarching questions. And we used these to organize our assessment of the state of knowledge regarding the connections between culture, heritage, and climate. In their briefest possible form, these questions were: what is the state of systemic understanding of culture, heritage, and climate change? 2, what are the roles of cultural governance? 3, what is the state of knowledge regarding loss, damage, and adaptation for culture and heritage? 4, what is the state of our capacity to learn from the past? And 5, what are the roles of culture and heritage in transformative change and alternative sustainable futures? Now, in order to prepare for this meeting, but with the constraints of the available funding that we had in mind, white papers were commissioned for 3 of these topics: systemic understanding, impacts, and the solutions, and then the other 2 were set as cross-cutting themes. There are 2 things I want to share with you from this meeting. First is, these questions were as thoughtfully and broadly framed as we were able to make them. The UNESCO team that was part of this project is from the office that oversees implementation of the 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Heritage. So they were very careful to make sure that this project addressed knowledge and practices and meanings, as well as tangible heritage, such as sites, buildings, landscapes, and so forth. But with this, with the established roles of UNESCO and ICOMOS, we used, and I would now say we were bound by, established international definitions of what heritage is. And briefly, the definition that we used is here. And by briefly, I mean I'm showing it to you and I'm not going to read through it for you. This definition is fairly comprehensive. With it, we tried to capture as many forms of tangible and intangible heritage as we possibly could. But the thing I want you to see with this is it is still primarily a list of things. And even though we set the questions behind these broadly and thoughtfully, with the phrasing of this IPCC AR5 question still in mind, there is still an element of this definition that looks to things connected to the past to either tell us or help us decide what to do. Second, I was co-chair of this meeting on behalf of ICOMOS for 2 years, from its inception through mid-2021. But I was not co-chair through the meeting itself, which was held the first week of December 2021, and I'm not part of preparing meetings from the reports, which is why I'm not actually sharing the outcomes of the meetings with you. This slide is intentionally blank. The reason for this is because there is a scientific integrity agreement that was set up to balance the needs and priorities of the IPCC with one of the project funders. A colleague at ICOMOS wished to break this arrangement. I said no. He became upset, and in the briefest possible description of the outcome, ICOMOS accepted my resignation. My purpose in describing this here is not directly to cast blame. I would rather not talk about it at all. I would rather talk with you about data and stories and science and models. But what this experience showed me, and the recent decisions here in the US with the Supreme Court, by the Supreme Court, is such a powerful reminder, is that we still live in a world where contracts and laws mean little if a person with power prefers something different. The world of heritage, as well as the world of the US Supreme Court, uses and is shaped by power and relationships. How we can work with power and relationships for climate is the outcome of the second big international event that I want to tell you about. In January 2022, the heritage organization ICRAM, which is the International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, based in Rome, held an international online conference called Climate, Culture, Peace. The focus of this conference was the intersections of climate change, culture and heritage, conflict and peace building, and disaster resilience. It had an emphasis on the Middle East and Africa, but participation and presentations were drawn from around the world. I had the honor of serving as scientific coordinator for this conference, so I was deeply involved with creating the program, preparing the report, monitoring sessions, all of those pieces. So what I'm sharing with you draws on all of that. The overarching theme of this conference was Culture, the Missing Link, which was similar to the underlying theme of the IPCC meeting, pointing to the need to develop a stronger and clearer articulation between climate change, culture, and heritage. But it did so in a different way. To explore this theme, Dr. Laura Jane Smith of Australian National University kindly gave the keynote. I know some of you may know her work better than I do. I had known of her work, which is in the area of critical heritage studies, for some time. But in all honesty, I have to say for several years, I had the perspective of, I am really busy with climate change right now. I just don't have time for this. Well, of course, I couldn't keep saying that through this conference. I had to listen very carefully. And I have got to say, my gosh, she got to me, or I got it. But either way, I am in. And I think some of the ideas that she presented is something that we need and can definitely use well to better connect archaeology and climate change. And briefly, what she said is this. It's that she said there is an authorized discourse of heritage, which defines heritage very briefly as things like grand, tangible, old, aesthetically pleasing, things that are good and great, value inherent, we conserve it for future generations, and it is fragile, finite, and non-renewable. Briefly returning, oops. There we are, to that UNESCO-based definition that we used for the IPCC meeting. Obviously, it is longer than the brief bullet point she shared, but there is that similar emphasis on things and the need to protect fragile things and conserve them for the future. In place of this, what Dr. Smith recommended is that heritage be understood as a process in which people negotiate the meanings of the past to address contemporary social and political problems and navigate change. In this definition, it isn't the things that are primary and they don't tell us what to do, but it is rather what we do with our relationships to those things, and that there is power and creativity and possibility in how we see, manage, and develop these relationships. What I see in Dr. Smith's work is also a powerful relationship to climate change, or powerful response to climate change. Over the past 12 years, I have been working directly on climate change from several roles within the US government here in Washington, DC. And from this, I propose that there is also an authorized discourse of climate change. Drawing from reports such as the US National Climate Assessment and the agencies that support it, the structure of the IPCC is, and a number of the organizations that fund and research elements of climate change, there is a discourse that defines climate change as being climate models, technology, observations, infrastructure, energy, water, extreme events. All of these things together make up the thing that we call climate change. The key is, if we line up these two authorized discourses, there is no visible overlap. So when we struggle to have archaeological and cultural heritage heard and used in climate discussions, which is something that both of these conferences were designed to address, I think part of it lies in this disconnect. But there is a way to create overlap. Dr. Smith's replacement definition is here. And in the briefest possible comparison from climate change, I will just point to the statements that were made in 2018 by world leaders at the COP24 conference, which was held in Poland, that clearly said at that point, what was most needed was not more scientific certainty, but rather the social and political will to act. We line these two up. We understand archaeology and heritage as being a social and political process to navigate change, and that our climate futures are the outcome of social and political will. These do overlap, and they have so much more to say to each other. So what does this mean for archaeology? What do we do with all of this? Well, in part to answer that and to wrap up my presentation, I want to share with you just two of the projects that were presented as part of Climate Culture Piece. The first comes from California, and it's an archaeological response to wildfire by two California archaeologists, Alex DeGiorgi and Michael Newland. Now, in recent years, through combinations of higher temperatures, droughts, invasive species, and more than a century of abandonment of indigenous prescribed burning practices, wildfires are increasing in intensity and size, severity, and spread. California has seen this happen horrifically, with fires devastating both forests and homes with ferocious speed, leaving the people who live in those homes not nearly enough time to really get out or to take the things that matter to them. In 2017, after one of these fires burned through his hometown of Santa Rosa, California, Alex DeGiorgi was asked if he could help recover cremains, which were remains of someone who had died previously and been cremated, and their ashes were in the homes of their family, but they could not be evacuated. Could they recover those cremains from the ashes of a home before everything was scooped up and carted off to a landfill? Working with Mike Newland, Alex and colleagues have developed a method that combines ethnographic interview, detailed mapping, trained sniffer dogs, and archaeological excavation to find cremains in the ashes, recover as much as they can, and return what they have recovered to surviving family members. They have now worked in the ashes of more than 300 homes to recover cremains after 8 major wildfires across California and Oregon. The situation of losing homes and contents to fires so completely and so rapidly at such a scale, this is new. Archaeological techniques of mapping and interview and excavation are not new. But in the face of this new challenge, what Alex and his colleagues have done is use archaeological tools and techniques creatively to help address it. My second example is drawn from 2 areas of Africa, in Africa. As presented by Peter Waswa, briefly shown here, and I'm sharing you briefly 2 of his slides from the Karamojo region of Uganda. In this area, combinations of drought and flooding are reducing the capacity of grazing lands, which in turn have destabilized social structures in the pastoral communities and increased longstanding tensions between pastoralists and farming communities. In turn, as presented by Aboyedan Aboye, in the Igboho region of Nigeria, pastoralists have also moved into areas that can support grazing that have shifted. Sorry, I did not say that well. Pastoralists have also moved into areas as their grazing lands have shifted, which has led to destruction of crops. But here, both sides have worked to reduce tensions, with farmers moving to more climate resilient crops and pastoralists working through social systems to help strengthen community relationships. What I wanted to share with you in both of these examples is that archaeology and heritage did not resolve the conflicts in both of these areas, and they certainly did not work alone. But in both cases, archaeology and heritage provided a context for the conflicts and the tensions that developed, showing the depth of human relationships involved. And in the case of the Igboho, the depth of those human relationships helped create a pathway out of the conflict. One of the things that concerns me greatly with respect to climate change and conflict is that several recent high-level reports produced in the global north describe climate change as a security issue. And in doing so, they treat conflict as something that occurs spontaneously and outside of cultural context. Archaeology and heritage are important in showing that many of the tensions that climate change will exacerbate have deep roots, but also growing alongside those deep roots may be social and community-based ways of managing some of those tensions. Circling back to where I began, if I could say one thing to the US Supreme Court, it would be this, and it's no, the past does not tell us what to do. We have a choice. And what I am seeing across international work on archaeology, heritage, and climate is that it is our capacity to ask questions of the past that is a tremendous source of creativity. Archaeology gives us the power to ask questions of the past and of ourselves about how we got here, what our values are, and the very theoretical and practical tools to choose whether and how we bring them forward with us into the future. I was so very grateful for all the creativity of my colleagues at the World Archaeological Congress, and I wish I could be there to share and hear all of the creativity that you are sharing there. So with that, I am going to say Thank you again so much for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. With all best. Thank you.